Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime.
Okay, besties, we're dropping in yet again with another re-release. It's the last one, we promise, because I have a doozy of a case that I'm almost done with for you next week.
Yeah, and as much as I hate to blast you with an oldie but a goodie, I am starting a new job this coming Monday. And while I won't get too much into specifics, I am moving into a new full-time position. And I am having to undergo training on my own behalf before I ever start finishing the onboarding process. And it's just been a little too difficult to get a case hammered out.
Yeah, so when this comes out, Hayden will be at his second day of work and I will be at my first day of work. So
in the UK.
Okay, yes. I think they probably know.
Yeah, but it's so different. I'm just video chatting with you and I'm like, this bitch is in the UK. Like, she just made a huge life transition.
It's almost 7 p.m.
Oh, that's crazy.
I know. The sun doesn't set until after 8.
It feels like 1 a.m.
But you know what? In the winter, when it's like dark for longer periods, I'm going to feel that. But
you're going to get a case of the SADS.
No.
The seasonal affective disorder.
Not if I get to see your face across the screen every week.
Okay. Well, no pressure. I'll act as your Lexapro. Or if you're like me, I guess I'll be acting like your Prozac.
Sure. You know the names of these things. I don't.
I do. And
Here's what I know, and I'm excited. Tomorrow, I'm going to pop into London, which is great. And I'm going to go have Easter lunch with my family. And there will be a huge Yorkshire pudding. And I'm excited for that.
What's a Yorkshire pudding? I know it's not pudding.
It's not pudding. It's really made out of egg, flour, a little bit of milk, salt.
Oh, it's savory?
Yeah, you put gravy in it.
Oh, God.
You eat it with roast.
I'm still processing that it's savory and it's a pudding. I'm going to have to go watch some Great British Bake Off to brush up on my British cuisine. British listeners, I hope you enjoy this content.
Yeah.
Because I don't know who else it's for. Do they have pudding in Canada since they are like...
So typically here, a pudding is a dessert.
I know. I know the pudding here. Me and the pudding here are great.
No, I'm saying here.
I'm talking about...
in the UK.
Oh, okay,
pudding is what is the word that is used instead of dessert.
Oh, it's just a dessert? Any pudding, a dessert is a pudding?
Right.
Well, that's also confusing.
Except for Yorkshire pudding.
Is cake a pudding? Is cheesecake a pudding?
I'll get back to you on that.
Is cobbler a pudding? Do they have cobbler in the UK?
Okay, that is sounds very American, cobbler.
Yeah.
But they have a lot of desserts that are similar to cobbler.
Okay.
All I know is I'm probably having treacle tart tomorrow with clotted cream ice cream.
And I'm sure that will be so good. What is clotted cream? This isn't a British podcast.
It's delicious.
This is not a Find Out About Britain podcast.
It's not, even though you've always wanted it to be.
Even though it's what I've dreamed of.
Right. So we are re-releasing Ray and Faye Copeland, recommended by my mom because she's a quilter. And if you haven't heard the case yet, you'll understand more about the relevance of that later.
And don't worry, because there is not a thimble large enough to protect you from the horror of how these people like to quilt. So I guess this is the re-release of Ray and Faye Copeland, and we'll see you guys on the other side. Cameron, for today's case, I think it would be really helpful if you could help the listeners understand what was romance and marriage like in the early 20th century? How did couples come to be together?
In the earliest
20th century.
Okay, in the early 20th century.
And I'm specifically talking 1920s, 30s.
I mean, basically, you met people who lived in close proximity to you or who you knew through close family.
So it was more about who was in your immediate vicinity.
Yes. Well, according to Aziz Ansari.
Okay, modern romance.
Yes.
In my new role as a social worker, one of the things I've discovered is a lot of couples who have been married for 50, 60, 70 years met each other through church functions.
Oh, yeah, I guess that tracks.
They either went to like a
It'd never be me.
We know heathen.
Wow. Wow.
Hearing so many people, and it reminded me, my own grandparents met at church. And while I don't want to qualify or quantify anyone's relationship as being a relationship of either comfort or a remedy to scarcity or survival, I do think it's really important that we examine the context of these marriages as a necessity for women who could not have their own bank account or their own credit lines until like the 1970s. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying from Aziz Ansari's book, Modern Romance, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
However, while related to today's story, is not a direct correlation to today's story, but the necessity of a husband sure is.
Just on the topic of our grandparents meeting, I don't know how my dad's parents met, but I know that my grandma, when she went on her first date with my grandpa, you know how I've been complaining about my coffee being sweet? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, my grandma also likes her coffee sweet, but she went on this date with my grandpa and they got coffee and he ordered his black, and so she didn't want to be seen as like too frou-frou or anything. So she ordered her coffee black.
Gross.
She's like, I hate black coffee. She drank black coffee for years.
Crazy.
To keep up the ruse. And I'm like, I can't even drink one cup of it. I am never going to be that committed to the bit.
But we also don't live in the same society or culture that we did then. Mm-hmm. So today,
100 years ago.
Oh my God, that was 100 years ago.
Yeah.
In this instance, I believe they were married roughly 90 years ago. Our couple that we're going to discuss today. But
so they married around 1934-ish?
Yes.
Okay.
Our story begins in the early 20th century.
Wow. Who could have imagined?
Ray Copeland was born on December 30th, 1914 in Oklahoma. His early life was marked by hardship and instability. His family moved frequently in search of work during the Great Depression. These economic conditions, especially at this time period, left a lot of families in a position of needing to move. So that wasn't super uncommon to be semi-nomadic. Ray's father, Jess Copeland, struggled to find steady work, and as a result, their family often moved town to town. This constant movement had a pretty significant impact on young Ray. By the time he was 9 years old, Ray had to drop out of school in the 4th grade. He needed to help support his family. Later on, there would be discussion of how this lack of formal education really limited some of Ray's opportunities and pushed him towards a life of petty crime. Then, at the age of 20...
Wasn't it? I mean, I can't imagine that it was very uncommon to not have graduated high school.
It wasn't uncommon, but so for instance, my dad's father didn't finish his entire formal education, but he left school after 7th grade. Mm-hmm. 4th grade was really young, I think, to end formal schooling.
Okay. And you said they moved around a lot.
They had to move around a lot.
But was it all in Oklahoma?
So I'm not exactly sure if Ray followed the pattern of his parents, then no, because they ended up moving to lots of different places. So at the age of 20, Ray committed his first known crime. He stole 2 hogs from his own father and sold them in another town.
Okay.
Although his father discovered this theft, he didn't file any kind of charges against his son. But this incident did mark the beginning of Ray's criminal career. In 1939, Ray was arrested for forging government checks in Harrison, Arkansas, for which he was sentenced to 1 year in county jail. And this early run-in with the law did very little to deter him from committing more crimes in the future. Some of these checks, these government checks that he was forging, were actually government checks meant for his brother. So not only was he forging these documents, but he was stealing from his own family.
Yeah, that's my takeaway, is that it really, based on what you've said so far, it seems like his crimes are centralized on his family, that he's not stepping outside of the family to commit crimes, which just seems like a choice.
It's weird to me that you would still... It begs the question of what his relationship with his father was like. And there's not really any information about that other than they just had to move a lot and it maybe wasn't necessarily great for Ray. But there is no details of his father being totally awful and terrible or why he would choose to forge checks that belonged to his brother. So
I wonder if part of the reason that he did drop out of school at 9, rather than it just being about helping make money for the family, I wonder if there was some sort of learning disability or maybe academic struggles that were at play that contributed to that.
Right. And intellectual disabilities don't necessarily equate to criminal behavior, but I would not be surprised if that were the case and that led to him having, like you just said, dropping out of school early or not being able to really complete material.
He may have been dyslexic.
Right.
Like, it might have been something as simple as this thing prevented him from being able to
It could have been the minorest of disabilities.
excel. Yeah.
But because we're talking about the 19 teens and 20s, all school was so standardized. There was a singular approach. If you had a learning disability, too bad, too sad, you just don't have what it takes to learn the material.
When I also imagine, so I guess there are several reasons that I'm curious about this. One, if they're moving around a lot, his education isn't consistent. So if he struggles already, then he's having more difficulties.
He's probably missing a ton of school on top of that.
Yeah. Two, I think that it's really confusing to me that the people who he chooses to steal from, it might have been opportunity. Like, well, this might have seemed really common sense. Like, oh, this stuff is right here, so I'll just do as I will with it. But it seems more confusing to me that he is choosing to take from the only constants that he's really had in his life.
And I think it raises the question of what kind of modeling did his father and family present to him. I wish there were more information on the father and the family's activity so I could have a better idea if that's something that Ray learned from him.
Oh, I'm just going to make something up right now, but it would not fully surprise me if the dad was maybe not always on the up and up.
Right.
And that was part of why they moved so much, was to your moving target.
Yeah. And back then, you could almost do anything and get away with it as long as you moved.
I mean, if that were true, would we be talking about this case?
That's why I said almost. Also, these crimes, the ones that are major, they don't happen in the 30s and 40s. So we'll get to it, though. Meanwhile, Faye Wilson was born on August 4th, 1921 in Harrison, Arkansas. Faye Wilson grew up in a very poor but hardworking family. She was one of 7 children. Her parents, Rufus and Gladys Wilson, despite their financial struggles, managed to maintain a stable home environment. So she had a lot of what Ray did not.
And Ray was out of how many kids?
Don't know.
Okay.
Faye met Ray shortly after his release from jail in 1940. Despite his criminal past, Faye was drawn to Ray. They married within 6 months, beginning a partnership that would eventually lead to one of the most infamous crime sprees in American history.
Infamous?
Yes.
All right.
Why?
It just makes me wonder if I've heard it before. Infamous to me is like, you've heard of this, you just maybe don't know the details.
Right. And I think that's gonna be the case. Like, when a person hears this story, it's really infamous for a particular reason. And yeah, it is infamous. And I think when you hear the story, you're going to be like, wow, I know them, but I don't know their names. But they kind of have a very distinctive dishonor.
So these are Bonnie and Clyde. This is just their government names.
No.
Oh, okay.
No. Well, I mean, kind of, but no.
Not kind of. Bonnie and Clyde, I think, are their names.
They're real people.
Right.
But like not altogether dissimilar.
All right, give me more.
So Ray and Faye Copeland's early years of marriage were really tumultuous.
Fun.
Could you imagine?
I would never want to.
The couple had 5 children: Everett, Billy Ray, Betty Lou, Alvia, and William Wayne. Due to Ray's criminal activities, the family moved frequently, never sitting in one place for too long. Ray's reputation as a fraud and thief grew, leading to multiple arrest and jail sentences. Each time Ray was released, the family would relocate, hoping to start fresh, but Ray's criminal tendencies always resurfaced. So I think to your point earlier about Ray's father moving, I think we can kind of see where that kind of socialization and modeling may have occurred, because every time Ray got out of jail, the family relocated.
Yeah, it's harder to track between towns, counties, states.
Which they do travel. In 1944, Ray decided to move his family to Fresno, California, where he and Faye had the bulk of their children. In 1949, following Alvia, William Wayne was born. And in this same year, Ray was accused of stealing horses from a local farmer. And while no charges were filed, his established reputation in Fresno County was left damaged. And then Ray picked up and moved his family back to Arkansas.
Why does nobody press charges on him for stealing their livestock?
Don't know. I have no idea why everyone's like, this is okay.
It makes no sense. so specific too. Like, if this is what drives me crazy, I understand giving people leniency or grace or a pass. I still think it should be documented. Sure, maybe there is no criminal time for it, but there are so many instances where somebody goes on to commit serialized, heinous crimes, and the first few instances of behavior is out there but not documented in a way that would help the legal system or the justice system hold them accountable.
Right. And no official records to share. Nothing that can be transferred in a meaningful way.
Right.
So at the very least, sure, you could at least report it and press charges and say, I'm not interested in like forcing him to pay anything or serve any time.
Do that thing where you just want $1. It's more about the principle. I'm all for it because we need better documentation about some of these things. We need to stop. Right. Oh gosh, we don't want to ruin his life. I mean, God, he's young.
I guess the only consideration is back then, culturally, which we still see today, but I'm sure was immense back then, is kind of this good old boy attitude. And secondly, I have to imagine when we're talking about systems that relied only on paper documentation, I'm not sure how helpful it would have been in the moment to have those documents if you're leaving Fresno County, California, and then going straight to Arkansas again. Because how are those documents shared?
Well, they're not, but I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
But also, I think that there would have been a little bit of, well, I guess I don't know enough about the criminal justice system, the history of when they started like tracking your crimes, and that was considered during sentencing.
Wow, we're so uneducated.
I know. Be right back. Gotta go get another
Let's
advanced
go get a criminal
degree.
justice degree. So less than a month after their relocation back to Arkansas, Ray was arrested again, this time for cattle theft.
Stop it. It's a different animal every time.
Pigs, horses,
cattle.
cow, moo. He was found guilty of grand larceny and sentenced to 1 year in jail. So there were consequences this time. And after completing this sentence, Ray moved the family to Rocky Comfort, Missouri. Could you believe that he was once again arrested for cattle theft?
Cattle, when there are chickens?
Goats, lambs. This time,
barnyard. I tried so hard to think of the only thing that I could think of was ducks.
Ducks, foie gras.
The only thing.
This time, Ray was sentenced to help in manual labor at the judge's farm. Oh, well, Judge, good for you.
Way to work that system.
Starting in 1953, Ray began following the same pattern as his parents did when he was a child, again moving the family from town to town. And during these travels, he was arrested at least 5 additional times for writing forged checks. So in addition to the cattle thievery and the other livestock thievery, along the way,
check forging that he was already sentenced for.
Yes, at the beginning with his brother, he's maintained that behavior. So at least 5 different counts of check forgery. During the summer of 1966, the Copeland family returned to Missouri, where Ray and Faye successfully purchased a small farm with 40 acres of land in Mooresville. I wonder how many forged checks he wrote to get enough money to buy a small farm.
Well, the cost of a small farm in, the 50s?
66?
In 66 was grossly different.
Far cheaper than now, especially in an undeveloped area.
Well, and especially because he's not having to buy any of the livestock. He's just taking them from his neighbors.
He's already got them. I think that how far did the money stretch then? But we know that it did, right? We know that it... Anyway.
I feel like money is very, very elastic when you're not actually going about acquiring it in a legal way.
Right. Well, you could just buy so much more for $1. And pay equity there was more pay parity amongst professions than there is now.
Yeah.
So to your point, I think that you're right in saying 40 acres probably wasn't a big stretch for someone back then.
Especially who steals all their money.
Exactly.
Or steals animals and sells it for money.
While Ray was off doing the things that Ray likes to do, like breaking the law,
That's just his hobby. He actually has a 9-to-5, and in his spare time, he forges checks and steals horses.
Faye took a job at a local glove making company. Ray proved unpopular with his neighbors. They viewed him as being a bitter elderly man and suspected that he physically abused his family. Faye and the Copeland children later denied these allegations, but then later still confirmed these allegations.
Yeah, that's standard. What does not sound standard to me is we're talking the 60s and we're talking neighbors thinking that it's their business. One, I would be interested in knowing why the neighbors suspected that. Two, I understand why the family would deny it and then eventually come out with the truth about it. But it surprises me that the neighbors felt like it was something that they had any business involving themselves with, which makes me think it was severe and very obvious.
I think that you're definitely right. In 1960s, in Missouri, no less.
Yeah, that's their business.
Right. You wouldn't
that's
mind
his house.
Exactly. And imagine what the standard for physical and familial violence must have been, that they were like,
Like to the point where they didn't like him.
Yeah. So it must have been something extreme.
Yeah.
Ray's control over his family was absolute. Again, he was thought of to be abusive, both physically and emotionally. And this abuse wasn't just directed at Faye, but also their 5 children.
Emotionally? Did that even exist in the 60s?
I don't think that we would say emotionally abusive then, but I think knowing what we know now, it's like when a person maybe takes an adverse childhood experiences inventory and learns that the childhood they thought was normal was not, because it's such a part of their daily routine. But I think it was very normal for him to devalue them, yell at them, curse at them, obviously beat them. And I think there was a level of emotional submission. And when you pair this abuse with the constant moving and Ray's criminal behavior, the family was constantly in a state of instability and fear. The children grew up under the shadow of their father's criminal activities and often had to change schools and make new friends. Would you believe that this cyclical generational behavior had a similar effect on his own children as it did on him? Both of their academic, educational, and social development was all hindered. Faye, despite the abuse, remained loyal to Ray. Now, when we say loyalty, I think it's really important that we parse out, was it loyalty? Was it fear? Was it a sense of duty? And I think that it's safest to assume that it's probably a combination of all of those things. Also, potentially just to protect her children to a degree that she could. What is clear is that Faye was an active participant in all of Ray's schemes. She would help select victims, she managed their finances, and she would work diligently to help cover up the crimes that Ray committed. I guess not very successfully.
Not long-term successfully, but it doesn't really surprise me because she had a full education, right? Did she graduate high school? And Ray is not, I don't know that Ray fully has the capacity. I think being raised by somebody who moves around that frequently,
right,
you don't think long-term or big picture. You're conditioned to not even think about those things.
Yeah, I don't think Ray's seen a big picture in his whole life.
No.
So Faye helped him select his victims, manage finances, and cover up all of his crimes. And what I appreciate the most about Faye helping her husband in this way is I think it really kind of takes this archetype and view of women in the 1960s and kind of flips it on its head. Here we have a woman who is equally duplicitous to her husband in the way that she helps him scheme and cover up his schemes.
Do you mean duplicitous with her husband?
Yes.
Okay.
What did I say?
To her husband.
Let's move in to the biggest scheme that Ray and Faye Copeland would eventually commit. By the late 1980s, Ray's criminal activities had evolved into a much more sophisticated and deadly nature. His inability to buy cattle due to his criminal record led him to develop a new method of acquiring livestock.
Okay, wait, was it some sort of scheme where he would act like he was going to pay for the cattle and then not?
Check forgery. He was forging checks left and right.
Got it. You've always talked about those as two separate crimes, but they were...
He would literally steal livestock.
Okay.
But he would also forge checks for livestock.
Got it.
Yeah, he was a man of many talents, a man of many means to get the things he wanted.
I mean, all he needed to do was just actually buy a...
Actually work?
Well, just
and
actually
buy?
Get a bull and a female cow?
You'd have to buy, like, several, but yeah.
I hear what you're saying. And I know that, but, like, just to get started, you can have 2.
That's true. But then their offspring wouldn't be breedable by the bull that you have.
Right, but
So you would need to acquire several cows.
but can't you take your offspring and then you have something to actually like trade or barter with?
Yeah, you can sell it.
Right. That's what I'm saying. If he's I mean, I guess I understand. It's faster.
Yeah, I guess if he wanted to be lucrative, I don't know how much he would get. Anyways, he could have done things more honestly. So when Ray came up against the wall of no longer being able to acquire livestock in the same criminal ways that he had, Ray and Faye decided that they would start hiring transient workers to help on their farm.
Yeah, this isn't good.
No, it sure isn't.
No, because transients typically are not looked for.
Correct. And if we're talking 1980s, before the advent really of cell phone use or the ability to communicate quickly, other than by telephone, we know that the odds of a transient victim being found or even looked for is low.
Yeah.
So these men that they would hire were often homeless, without any kind of stable life or financial means, and it really made them easy targets. Ray and Faye would set up checking accounts and the names of these transient workers, and then they would use these accounts to write bad checks for cattle purchases. And this scheme allowed Ray to continue his criminal enterprise without directly implicating himself. These transient workers, again, were the perfect targets. Oftentimes, they also had no ties to the community, and like we said, would not be missed if they disappeared. As they would work on the farm, Ray would promise them a place to stay and food to eat, and once they agreed, Ray would go ahead and set up these different checking accounts. Ray and Faye would then travel to many different locations to purchase cattle, and they would bring them back to the Copeland farm, where they would either then be sold or used to support their farming operations. Ray and Faye discovered, though, that keeping these transient workers around posed a risk. If they ever realized the extent of Ray's fraud, they could A, potentially report him and expose the scheme, or B, just turn against him. To eliminate this risk, Ray resorted to murder. Once the workers had quick jump, right?
Yeah, to eliminate this risk, we eliminated the risk.
100%. They went above and beyond. Ray would often kill these transient workers, shooting them in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The bodies would then be buried somewhere on or near the Copeland farm, often hidden from view. This methodical approach to murder really ensured that the Copeland's crimes remained undetected for years. This was the savviest criminal activity that Ray and Faye Copeland ever perpetuated, because they went years and years without being caught.
Well, I think for them, what they were doing seemed like a victimless crime, because for them, a victim is somebody who can like follow the trail and lead back to them.
Right.
And they were targeting people who didn't have ties to anyone that would recognize that they were missing, rather than just moving around.
Right. They knew there would be no impact from the disappearance of the victim.
Right. Not to devalue these lives. That's what I'm saying. I think that was their perception.
But it made it easy for them to view them as being non-human.
Right.
No, I totally agree with you. The Copelands farm, which was located in rural Missouri, was really remote. It wasn't really near anyone. They didn't have a lot of neighbors, and the local community didn't really have any kind of idea of these transient workers working for Ray and Faye Copeland. The image that they ultimately were able to cultivate for themselves in their community in this rural Missouri area was that they were kind of simple, hardworking people. So for the first time in maybe their entire existence of moving from place to place, Ray was able to not piss off and anger all of the residents of the community. Ray and Faye's reign of terror might have gone on unchecked for forever. However, in August 1989, Jack McCormick, a transient worker who had appeared in the community and then worked for the Copelands, called the Nebraska Crime Stoppers hotline. He claimed to have seen human bones on the property and that Ray had tried to kill him. Initially, sorry, I don't mean to laugh, but it's wild that he was able to get away and call Crime Stoppers of Nebraska.
Yeah. Were they in Nebraska?
No.
Where were they?
Missouri.
Was he from Nebraska?
He may have been. That makes sense. But that's who he ended up getting connected with. Now, I will say there were some different sources. I hate to say it, but like Murderpedia and like Midwestern Murder Journal kind of reported a little differently. I believe one of them said it was a Nebraska Police Department, but then I found like 2 other sources that confirmed it was Crime Stoppers.
Yeah.
So just for our listeners' sake, I want them to know that there is some discrepancy in that reporting about who he called, but it seems that it was a Crime Stoppers line. Police were initially skeptical, but decided to investigate due to Ray's extensive criminal background. The search of the Copeland farm began in October 1989 and included dozens of officers and bloodhounds. Now, Jack McCormick had worked on the Copeland farm, earning up to $50 a day. And like many transient workers, he had been lured by the promise of steady work and decent pay. However, McCormick pretty quickly realized there was something amiss. He witnessed firsthand the check fraud and the cattle scam. And one day, after a particularly tense exchange, Ray turned on Jack, leading up to the event where he was nearly shot and killed. Jack describes his experience as having turned around and seeing the barrel of the gun at his face.
Okay. I was going to say, how was he nearly, but...
Well, and it turns out Jack was able to manage to talk his way out of being killed. So it's not like he ran away. It's not like he saw him from a distance. Ray Copeland really had him up against a wall. Ultimately, what he did is that he promised Ray that he would leave town and never come back. He also convinced Ray to take him to the bank to deposit his earnings to cover a hot check that he had written. Once they arrived at the bank, Jack actually slipped out of the back and made his way to a used car lot where he took a car for a test drive and fled to Nebraska.
Is this the same guy that called Crime Stoppers?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, same guy.
I was like, how many Nebraska...
I know.
So he's definitely from Nebraska.
He's got to be from Nebraska.
Yeah.
Why else would you flee back to Nebraska? Gary Calvert of Livingston County was the head detective who led this investigation against Ray and Faye Copeland. And Calvert was really highly respected. He also wasn't quite convinced with this kindly farmer image that Ray had cultivated. Sorry, farmer cultivated.
Okay. I mean, it is just, I don't really think that he's much of a farmer because he just steals everything.
As he dug deeper, a new picture emerged.
You really love what you've done here. Farmers cultivating and digging.
Ray was a cantankerous man who ruled his household with an iron fist. His mantra was essentially, do it or get beat. Calvert's thorough background check revealed Ray's history of check fraud, bankruptcy a few years earlier, and the cattle fraud scheme. And Jack McCormick's story became all the more credible. This investigation ended up being quite complex. It required the cooperation of multiple law enforcement agencies. The initial tip from Jack McCormick set off a chain of events that eventually led to the Copelands' arrest and conviction. Most deputies at this time had again dismissed the allegation, but Calvert remained persistent. David Hain, a Brookfield police officer, knew that Ray was not a good person, and he also understood that one of the first steps to helping build this case against the Copelands would be to track down the transient workers who had worked for them. This proved to not be an easy task. Most of these transient workers had no social security number and were essentially experiencing homelessness with no one looking for them. Calvert changed up his tactics and started reaching out to families who hadn't heard from their loved ones in some time. However, when he began, Paul Stegmeyer's family, for instance, was really used to hearing from him regularly, but they had not heard from him since he had gone missing after working for the Copelands. In most of these cases, these transient workers for the Copelands would be there for 2 to 3 days and sometimes even weeks. The initial surviving transient worker that we talked about earlier, Jack McCormick, he was kind of an exception to how Ray and Faye operated with their transient workers. After fleeing to Nebraska, McCormick was still on parole, and he had been in trouble for writing bad checks. There was a warrant out for his arrest.
So he was right. He was a good person for them to use because he was in the game.
He was a pro. And ultimately, this record that McCormick had, despite having been a transient worker of Ray and Faye Copeland's, ended up helping detectives and investigators find him once again for further questioning to try to kind of understand what was happening with the Copelands to a greater extent. Once they were able to find him, they brought him back to Livingston County. Another transient worker that had worked for Ray and Faye Copeland was Jimmy Page. Jimmy came forward and he corroborated the check scheme. Gary Calvert, who had been leading the investigation, began working with Leland Odell, the sheriff of Livingston County. And as they continued to gather evidence and speak with Jimmy Page and James McCormick, they learned that Ray and Faye Copeland would actually travel to Springfield, Missouri, find transient workers, make them these promises of work, and then bring them back to their farm.
Almost like an added layer of they're being transient.
Right. I think so.
Taking them to a small farm in a small town, but taking them from the city.
Yes. Taking someone who's already difficult to locate and without consistent housing.
And removing them from their last known location.
Yes.
To a small town and a small farm.
Somewhere more remote.
A small graveyard.
That's technically true.
Yeah. That was what got McCormick. That's why the hair stood up on the back of his neck, because he found the bones, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And actually, when he brings investigators back to that location, it's, I believe, the remains of 3 different transient workers that he stumbled upon. The small rural community that the Copelands lived in had a really hard time believing that this kind of ongoing story was true. Ultimately, Calvert ended up needing to call in authorities from several surrounding counties, such as Chillicothe and Grundy County's Sheriff Greg Kuhn and the Highway Patrol. Jack, once again, was of service by drawing up a map of the farm where he had seen things. And it was at this point that Calvert felt really confident that they could obtain all of the necessary search warrants they needed to explore the Copeland farm. In the early morning hours of an undisclosed date, the Copeland farm was raided, as well as the farmhouse.
You said rated, and I was like, what, 1 to 10? But you mean rated, like with an I.
Yeah. All of these law enforcement agencies were called in and assisted in the raid of the Copeland farm, the farmhouse, and the barns. By most accounts, it was exactly what you would expect an old farming couple to live in. Calvert had Ray, while Greg Kuhn had Faye. And at that time, Ray wasn't actually at home, only Faye was home.
Can you remind me what year we're in right now?
Oh, gosh, it's the 1980s.
Yeah, but earlier you were saying August 89. Is that this?
October 1989.
Baby's first Halloween.
Yeah, you were alive.
Mm-hmm.
Ray was found by Calvert at a diner in town where he was later arrested.
After he finished his eggs and bakey?
There's also reports, and I didn't actually include this in here, that Ray, despite people only thinking of him and Faye as being this old farming couple, while also simultaneously thinking he was too rough, he was kind of just rude to people in general.
You said he was cantankerous.
Yeah. And so at places like the diner, he was impolite to wait staff. Ray was held on charges related to the check and cattle schemes. And when the Copeland children found out about the arrest, they were already used to Ray being in trouble. It wasn't anything new for their father to have fallen into the wrong side of the law.
How old were the kids?
Oh gosh, at this point, they were born late 1930s through the 40s.
Oh, they're grown.
Yeah, they're 40s and 50s.
Yeah. So they...
probably mid-30s.
They weren't around...
to early 50s.
For the murders.
No, I don't believe so.
And they weren't aware of the murders.
Well, again, they weren't surprised that their dad had gotten himself into trouble again, but this is the first time their mom had been charged with anything. When Faye was able to speak with some of her children, she asked her children to move quilts before the police arrived, but she emphasized for them to not touch any of the pictures, indicating that she was aware of the investigation and maybe wanted to protect certain pieces of evidence. The law enforcement agents ended up spending several days on the farm, going through things like burn piles and digging holes over the property.
Am I going to know what the quilts and pictures?
Oh, you sure will.
Okay.
We're going to circle back. We're going to circle back to the quilts.
Good, because I won't be able to think of anything else until I know. Did she make quilts with the clothes
Hold on. On October 17th, they also searched other surrounding farms and areas for any kind of human remains. They used steel rods to probe the ground. They found 3 places. They dug down 18 to 24 inches and found the remains of 3 men wrapped in plastic with clothing. The victims were identified as Paul Cowart from Arkansas, John Freeman from Oklahoma, and Jimmy Harvey from Missouri. All had been shot in the back of the head with a .22 caliber rifle. The killings and cold burials really kind of came as a shock to the officers despite conducting this search, because it took them a while to find the bodies. They were kind of maybe under the impression, and especially with some of like the community outcry, that maybe this was a wild goose chase. Eventually, both of the Copelands were charged with murder, and in late October 1989, both had been arrested for the murder of at least 3 transient workers and were placed in different facilities. A lot of people in their community, they were very resistant to this idea, but after the evidence was found, they were willing to accept that Ray had done this.
But not Faye.
Not Faye. They had a really hard time believing that Faye was...
This sweet woman.
Yes. They couldn't believe that she was really involved with the murder of these transient workers.
Why? It probably kept her from being as abused.
Exactly.
It's like a self-preservation thing.
Yeah, and we know from resources that for Ray Copeland, his whole entire thing, his mantra, his personhood was defined by this idea of you either do as I say or you get beat. Those are your 2 options.
Well, and I think there's maybe an element of kill or be killed for her too. Like participate in this killing or you're going to be beaten to death.
Yeah.
At the worst.
Or you'll have a .22 caliber bullet
You'll be
in the
buried
back of
in
your
the
head.
ground. Yeah. And there'll be something to do with a quilt.
Ultimately, authorities ended up finding another body, Wayne Warner, and he had been killed in the same manner. They also found another transient worker by the name of Dennis Murphy in a nearby well.
Do you know how they were able to identify? Did they have identification on the bodies or?
I'm not exactly sure how they were. Oh, I actually am sure, but it's coming in a moment.
Okay.
I will say it says that one resource said that Dennis Murphy actually had a belt on, a leather belt with his name on it. The police found a small caliber handgun, a .22 rifle, and a shotgun in the master bedroom. They also found laundered clothing that neither Ray or Faye could wear or fit into. Some of the items bared the victim's initial. Mm-hmm. They also found a list in the house with several names, and the bodies that they found on the property, those names were on this list that they found, and for each person who was found dead, there was an X beside their name. So I maybe said that in a complicated way, but Ray and Faye Copeland kept a list of every transient worker they employed.
And then they X'd them after they
killed them.
Axed them.
Yeah. Yes. They were X'd once they were X'd. What an eloquent phrase that you coined. The handwriting for this list of names matched perfectly with Faye Copeland.
Well, how did the neighbors respond to that? Did the community finally accept that she was a part of this?
Faye, it doesn't say what the community reaction was to this list with X's, but we do know that Faye said that, yes, I wrote the names, but I was never the one to put the X by the name. Ballistic tests confirmed that the bullets from these weapons that they had in their master bedroom matched the .22 rifle found in the different victims.
Jeez, that was such a dark phrasing.
Ultimately, Jack McCormick and Jimmy Page testified against the Copelands, and in November of 1989, the media really descended upon this area of Missouri, and the prosecution ended up offering Faye a deal. She could cooperate, reveal the locations of all the victims, and she would receive a lighter sentence. She refused, maintaining her innocence. On November 13th, both Ray and Faye faced multiple murder charges with separate trial dates. Again, both claimed innocence. By March 1991, both had been found guilty of first-degree murder. Faye received 4 death penalties, and Ray received 5. So, different.
Yeah, they each immediately go to appeal because it is a death sentence, which is an automatic appeal.
Yes.
And so you do it that way so that even if 1 is overturned or 3 are overturned, they still are sentenced to death with. It's just like
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like throwing however much at the wall and seeing what sticks, kind of. It more of a security blanket.
Okay, that makes sense.
Speaking of blankets, you never told me about the quilts.
Okay. Well, I still have that further down.
Okay.
But what authorities come to find is that these quilts that Faye had her children remove from the home were at least partially crafted with the clothing of the victims they had killed.
So my question earlier, you could have said yes.
I could have just said yes. I was trying to wait for where I had it in the case, but no, absolutely. They, it kind of seems like a bit of that Depression era ethic where we don't waste anything. So we'll use these clothes that we don't fit into of the victims that we killed and turn them into a quilt.
I also think it's less suspicious to have quilts that are made of fabric that people maybe don't know where the fabric came from.
Don't keep the fucking clothes. That would be the least suspicious thing.
There are bodies buried on the property. I feel like the bodies are more suspicious than...
But if Faye is going to maintain innocence after getting caught, like, bitch, don't fucking use your sewing skills to create a murder blanket.
She's like, I didn't know where the clothes came from. My husband just brought them home one day.
He just brought these scraps home.
And since nobody fit into them, I made quilts with them.
Insane.
For the grandkids.
And I feel like they probably had enough quilts. Like, they were probably at an age where they had plenty of quilts.
Just like me. Because my mom quilts and my grandma quilted and I have quilts.
Quilts are amazing. I wish I had more handmade quilts.
Say it louder. My mom will make you a quilt.
Okay, good. I've got some of my grandmother's old clothes that I want turned into a quilt.
Oh, yeah.
Not a murder quilt, obviously.
No.
But a loved one comfort quilt.
Yeah.
I didn't need to qualify that. Now it feels like it's...
like that you've got some clothes that
like
could
I'm
be
Faye
a murder
Copeland.
quilt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, the community had kind of a mixed reaction. Some felt that Faye had been a victim in terms of being complicit with Ray due to coercion or duress. However, it seems like most of the community ended up deciding that they were both culpable and guilty. 2 years after being placed in prison, Ray died from some kind of undisclosed health issue. Faye's death sentence ultimately ended up being overturned and commuted in 1999. She was paroled to a nursing center in 2002, where she died of natural causes. So it wasn't overturned, but it was commuted. And then paroled to a nursing center in 2002, where she died of natural causes at the age of 82. Faye would claim throughout the entirety of her time in prison and leading up to it that she had begged Ray to stay out of trouble. So a little further clarification on exactly what happened with the commuting of her sentence. Faye's attorneys appealed her conviction and contended that the jury had not been allowed to hear any evidence that Ray had been abusing her for years. And on August 6, 1999, Judge Ortree Smith overturned the death sentence, but let the conviction stand and commuted her sentence to 5 consecutive terms of life without parole. On August 10, 2002, Faye suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. And weeks later, in September 2002, Governor Bob Holden authorized a medical parole for Faye, fulfilling her wish that she not die in prison. She was paroled to a nursing home in her hometown of Chillicothe, Missouri, where she died of natural causes at the age of 82. She left behind 5 children and 17 grandchildren.
And how many quilts?
An undisclosed number.
Okay.
Far too many. One is too many.
One murder quilt.
Of murder victims.
Yeah. I was like, one quilt is too many? I hear what you're saying, though. I got it.
Ultimately, the issue with the Copeland family and their kind of mass murdering of transient workers, or serial murder of transient workers, left a terrible mark on the community of Mooresville. Ultimately, Ray and Faye are the oldest couple to have ever been put to death in the United States, or at least sentenced to death, although neither of them died by execution.
Right.
While this case is awful and the lives of many transient workers were stolen, I do think there's an interesting lesson to take from this case in terms of any person at any age is capable of evil, of crime, of murder. And I think so often as a society, when we see elderly people, we think of them as
frail,
and capable of doing such a thing, both morally and physically.
Sweet, cute,
principled in a good way.
Yeah.
And I think that Ray and Faye Copeland prove that that's not always true. We are too unassuming when it comes to the elderly. Or maybe we're too assuming. We assume too much kindness when we ought to assume, oh, oh, there's a lot of life experience here.
Yeah.
They have a history, a long history. They've made plenty of mistakes to get here.
But then there's also a stereotype with older people about them being crotchety.
That's true.
But I mean, not all.
But I mean, crotchety doesn't equate killery.
No, none of it. We can't. Murder is always the exception. That is not the norm.
100%.
The general population, it doesn't matter what demographic you look in, I guess aside from the murderer demographic, that's not the norm. Even in the demographic of psychopaths, murdering is not the norm.
Correct.
That was a really interesting yet disturbing story, but you told it really well.
Thank you so much. I feel like the story is interesting, which is why I picked it, but also weirdly upsetting and kind of devastating in the way that what I think is most interesting about it is that these people of a certain age are committing these horrible crimes. It's almost upsetting to know that it's possible, that it happened.
I mean, that's what I meant when I said disturbing.
Yes.
You know, grandma and grandpa may be out there murdering. You never know. You never know.
Wow, what should we get them for Christmas? A scythe?
Hard candy. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe, give us a 5-star rating, and leave a review.
Recommend us to a friend, and if you're able and willing to help us produce this podcast, sign up for our Patreon.
The link to joining our supportive bestie tier on Patreon for just $2 a month is listed in the show notes. Also, make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so feel free to reach out with questions or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.